My name is Mike Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in the Conservation Sciences graduate program. I'm a student at Dan Larkins and I work on aquatic plants. And being someone who works on plants, I'm excited to introduce you to Tom Landwehr. Tom Landwehr is now the executive director of the
Save the Boundary Waters.
Thank you. Save the Boundary Waters. And he is also the recent recipient of the FWCB 2020 Alumni of the Year. And the reason I'm excited to introduce him as a plant person is during his acceptance of that FWCB award, he let us know that one of his most cherished memories from his time in conservation in Minnesota actually was planting a prairie restoration. So in my mind, he's gone from a wildlifer who has degrees in wildlife biology from FWCB now to someone who really thinks about habitat and thinking about that plant community. So Tom also has served 2 terms as the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Commissioner, in addition to serving with the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota and the Dakotas, and Ducks Unlimited. And so with that, Tom, I just want to again congratulate you on your receipt of the 2020 Alumni of the Year, and pass it off to you. I look forward to learning a little bit about your forays into the conservation stories of Minnesota.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and happy to see you all. So many people I know from various aspects of work. It's wonderful to be here with you, and I appreciate people attending. Of course, the subject here was not my idea. It was Mike's or Nick's idea. So I thought a description of 40 years of conservation work would actually put people to sleep, and it probably will. So if you feel sleepy, just turn your camera off and you can nod away, and nobody will ever know. It's much more practical than it actually is in person. But well, thank you. I'm going to, let's see, if, I'm going to have to figure out how I can share my screen here. So Mike and Nick asked if I would give you a little description of some of the work that I've done over the last 40 years. And I'm happy to do that. I think, you know, my purpose in doing this is really to give you some insight into the options. If you're in wildlife management, there's corollaries here, I think, to fisheries management, as well as conservation biology and forestry and others. My path was in wildlife, so that's what I can speak mostly about. So give you some idea of some of the options that are out there for the kind of work many of your students will be going on to something besides academia. And so here's some insight into some of the roads you can go down. And also, you know, for in my case, how some of these doors actually opened up, and the steps that I took to try and make sure I opened some of those doors. A little bit about the nature of the work. I can tell you, when I was an undergrad and even a grad student in wildlife at the U, I really did not have a good idea of what the work actually entailed. You know, when I got a wildlife degree, now what do I do? Some conceptual understanding, but not really a hands-on understanding. So I want to give you a little sense of that as well as some of the accomplishments that that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of, to give you an idea of, you know, really the impact that you can have, especially if you're, you know, at the beginning of your career. You know, there really are a lot of opportunities for you to really make a difference in the world. And so what I want to do is give you a little sense of where I originally came from, to talk about some of my college experiences, my realization about some of the options that were out there, how I ended up on the path that I did, and then again, what sorts of things that I can point to as having had a part in accomplishing. So I started out with this slide last week at my at the Alumni Award. This is my 5th grade class. I am the boy in the orange shirt in the middle. I didn't know much about anything back then. I surely did not know what I wanted to do when I grew up, and it pretty much stayed that way all the way through high school. It was only when I was compelled to finally make a decision that I had an interest in conservation And so I started at the U the semester after I graduated from high school. My notion of conservation was what I saw in a full-page ad in Outdoor Life. And that full-page ad showed a forester up on the top of a fire tower in the mountains, scanning the horizon, looking for fires. And I thought, well, that looks like a great job. I think maybe I'm interested in conservation. And so when I applied at the U, I did not have a college advisor. So I was kind of just scrambling to find out what kind of programs there were to go into. You know, back in the day, this is going to be hard for some of you to understand, everything was on paper. And so you had to get a booklet of classes. You had to look through the classes and find what was most interesting. What I landed on was forestry. So I took general classes my first year. The one class that I had that was natural resources oriented was forestry. I failed miserably in forestry. And the sad reality for me was at the end of the year, actually we were on a quarter basis, on the end of the third quarter, I was failing miserably. I had a C average. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I dropped out, and I had a couple of gap years. About a year and a half, I did not go to school. I did spend a fair amount of time outdoors, and so that fifth grade person turned into that person. That's actually on the edge of the boundary waters, not quite in the boundary waters. It was mostly an alcohol-fueled adventure, not so much nature appreciation, but we did really enjoy our time outdoors. And I realized in that year and a half, when I was doing a lot of manual labor and a lot of menial labor, that I really didn't want to grow old in my life being a laborer, that I really felt I needed to go back to school and somehow pursue some interests and find a way to work with my brain rather than my back. I was delighted in that time that I found out that there was a fish and wildlife program at the University of Minnesota. I didn't realize that. I had, it was a kind of an epiphany for me. It's like, geez, I can get a degree in hunting and fishing. That sounds great. And so I started in the program back in 1977, I believe was the year I started back. And I had some good guidance from some of the professors there, Dan Frenzel in particular. And also started having some exposure to DNR. And I realized as I was going through my undergraduate program there, more than anything, I wanted to get a job at DNR. I wanted to be a DNR wildlife person. And so I got my undergrad in 1980. My undergrad advisor later on was Jim Cooper, Dr. Jim Cooper, who offered me a master's program, which I joined in 1981. But during that period of time, too, I realized that it was going to be very, very competitive. In fact, at the time, DNR used to require a test. You had to take a test, pass a test, to get into any of the natural resource professional jobs. And so I took the wildlife manager test. There were some 380 people interviewing for that one job. And so it was very, very competitive. I knew that I had to have some kind of background field experience in order to do any good in any of these opportunities. So I started out, I think I was a sophomore or junior. I did some volunteer for a fisheries graduate student. That actually led to a job doing stream surveys for DNR because the grad student knew the advising professor who worked with DNR and got me that summer job, which is an amazing summer job, traveling around the state, sampling fish in streams. At the time, I thought I wanted to be a fisheries manager because I thought there'd be more jobs available. That stream survey job led into a summer job with the Corps of Engineers doing water quality work on the Mississippi River behind some of the dredges that were working on the river at the time, which then subsequently led to a student worker job at DNR doing statistical analysis. Now this will really date me, but it was at the time, and this would have been about 1980, the only computers that were available were the mainframes at the university. You probably don't even know what a mainframe is, but they were big room-sized computers. And outside of a hand calculator, if you wanted to do any kind of statistical analysis, you had to actually go over to the university, bring a box of punch cards and secure your time to run them through the computer and then get a paper printout. I took a class in programming language in my senior year that actually gave me a pretty good exposure to sort of the breaking technology at the time. And that's what helped me get that student worker job. It was doing analysis of hunting surveys. And so it was a number heavy, data heavy analysis. And so it led me to get that job. I was working I did my field work in 1982 for my master's, and then I got a job with DNR. So it took me 4 more years to actually write up my thesis. And during that time, I secured my first job, real job at DNR. That was a wildlife research tech. That was in 82. And again, because of my computer experience of all things, I was able to land that job. So I knew how to do these statistical analyses for computers, and that was very appealing to the research people at DNR. I got that technician job. A little more humorous trivia. The section of wildlife unit that I was in actually secured one of the first computers that the DNR owned. That was at the time when the Apples were just coming out and the PCs were just coming out. We secured an Apple II computer. I think it had, a couple thousand K of RAM memory. It actually had a screen, a monitor that would show 40 characters across left to right on the screen. You couldn't even view the whole 80 characters of a normal screen. You had to toggle back and forth. But we were just elated when we got that because we could actually do some real data analysis. So that was some entree into the technology that is just laughable today. So during that time at DNR, one of the most valuable learnings I had was I could find out what actual kind of work somebody might do with a wildlife management degree. And of course, I started out in research. And when you look at the DNR as an example, DNR is probably the largest employer of natural resources professionals in the state. And so I think it's a good model. Probably of all of the people with a wildlife or fisheries degree, less than 5% are actually engaged in research. Most of the people are engaged in management. And so what I realized is that the options to be in research were fairly limited. When you're in the middle of the baby boom, there are a lot of people ahead of you who are going to be there for just about as long as you are. And so mobility is sort of limited when you have a small pool and a lot of people. But research, and many of you are familiar with that, the university is a great institution for learning research. But in the DNR, there are many, many more opportunities for management. And so wildlife managers, there are probably, 120 of them working for DNR Wildlife, and there are probably 20 researchers. And so it offered a lot more opportunity for getting a job, promoting, and so on. Wildlife managers, to Mike's point, they don't really manage wildlife, they manage habitat. That's something you learn early on as well. And so when you're a wildlife manager, you have responsibility for some portion of geography. So for instance, my first assistant manager job, we covered 3.5 counties, Southwest Metro. We managed the public land. We acquired public land. We planted prairie. We burned prairie. We did wildlife surveys. We met with landowners who had nuisance problems and so on. And that, for me, was the most appealing avenue in the field, is to get into the management. Of course, there are some people who came out of school with technical degrees like wildlife management who ended up in very, very important support jobs. Our acquisition coordinator at DNR for many years was a fellow graduated a little bit ahead of me at the University of Minnesota by the name of Kim Hennings. And Kim personally oversaw the acquisition of 250,000 acres of wildlife management area in the state of Minnesota. So a very important role, different than what you might think of when you're in the wildlife management program, but extremely important for the program. Administration, this was one of my aha moments, is that when you look at any natural resources organization, whether it be the DNR or the Fish and Wildlife Service or the county soil and water conservation district, most of the administrators in those agencies actually rose up through the ranks. There's some real value to that. You want somebody who's heading up the Division of Fish and Wildlife, for instance, to have a good understanding of the biology so that they can make good decisions when faced with tough decision making. But what the downside of that is that, you know, when I came out, even with my master's degree, I didn't know anything about budgets. I didn't know anything about human resources management. I didn't know anything about strategic planning. You know, many of the characteristics that you would like to see in a good administrator are not things that we learn in our education or necessarily on a job. So I think it's a very, very important, I would argue it's extremely important to have good administrators, and that is one of the avenues that you can pursue. And of course, you know, one of the most valuable avenues as well is to be the person who's teaching our next generations of biologists, and I recognize that was an option as well. It was not an area that appealed to me much, and again, in particular, because at the time, I did not see that as a really good place to look for a job. There's not a lot of teaching positions available. So those were avenues that became obvious to me in my early years at DNR. If I wanted to sort of plot a career path, those were some of the options that I saw available to me, and there's probably more. And at the same time, you know, it was important to look at, you know, what was out there for employers. You know, I early on knew I wanted to work for DNR, but there's also, of course, the federal government, and there's local county offices and so on that all hire resource professionals. In my mind, you know, working for the state allowed me to stay in Minnesota, a state I love, and you know, work with things I know, work with people I know. So I chose that. My belief at the time as well, with respect to the federal government, was just so big. I mean, you could be moved anywhere in the country, but it was also so big. It was just very bureaucratic, and I felt like it would be somewhat stifling to getting a lot done. Not saying that's true, but that was my perception. At the time, you know, there were a couple of private options. You know, nuisance wildlife management is actually a growing industry. At the time, there were a few of them, but there are more of them now. And a lot of engineering firms hired consultants to do like environmental review and things like that. Today, nonprofits offer a really robust and viable career option, I think. And back at, you know, in the 80s, that was not so much the case. There were a handful of nonprofits that hired professional staff, but not very many. Today, there's numerous of them, and I've worked for 3 of them now, Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, now with the Save the Boundary Waters campaign. So they are a really viable alternative, and because they tend to be smaller, they're more nimble and more innovative in many respects than government, and so therefore they've got some real appeal. And of course, academia, you know, becoming a teacher, an instructor, a professor is another route for people. Career ladders. I always thought that there was such a thing as a career ladder. Not so much. This is not really. There's not really a way that you can, especially at the beginning of your plot where you are going to go or what you're going to do. You have to have sort of a goal in mind of what you want to do, and then look for opportunities as they open up. The 2 pictures, by the way, are when I was a wildlife manager. The bottom picture, we were doing some prescribed fire training, and I will offer that both those jobs were immensely rewarding and enjoyable, actually managing habitat, not managing critters and not managing people. So really the path that I've got is more one of evolution in my thinking, guided by opportunity. So I knew that I really enjoyed wetlands. I really enjoyed waterfowl. I had at one time really aspired to be a state waterfowl biologist. I clearly was not smart enough for that. We've got some really good people, and Todd knows many of them, who have done a lot of really good work on waterfowl in the state and across the country. But I always had a desire to work with waterfowl and wetlands. And so some of the opportunities that opened up actually allowed me to work in that arena without actually being the waterfowl biologist. I mentioned my first job, professional job, was as a research technician. I did that job for about 1.5 years. It was entirely office work, it was entirely on a computer. And I knew, fairly quickly that that is not where I wanted to be. In 1982, the pheasant population in the state of Minnesota crashed. And Dennis Anderson, he was a reporter at the Pioneer Press at the time, wrote a lengthy series of articles that ultimately led to the creation of Pheasants Forever. Pheasants Forever was created, I believe, in 1983. At the same time, a pheasant stamp was passed in the state of Minnesota. The pheasant stamp revenue was used in part to hire 4 private lands technicians. One of them was in the Southwest Metro, and I applied for it and I got that job. So my job from 84 to 87 was working with private landowners to get them to put good habitat on their property to enhance pheasant production, pheasant population growth. It was during that same period that the Farm Bill actually started having some valuable elements of habitat creation, like the Conservation Reserve Program, for instance, came along in 1985. Wetland Reserve Program came on sometime after that. By virtue of having that private lands experience, I was actually able to provide valuable input, I think, into some of the rules and administrative procedures that were used to implement CRP and WRP in the state. And so that was very rewarding, and also a first chance to look at sort of policy work as a biologist. I worked in that position for 3 or 4 years, and then a area wildlife manager position opened up. So I was an assistant in my first job. The second job, I was the head of the office in Madison, Minnesota, which is out in western Minnesota. The area wildlife office oversaw the DNR wildlife activities in 2 counties, Lac-Parle and Yellow Medicine. And so that again involved acquiring land for wildlife management areas, managing those areas. So we did, tree plantings, prairie plantings, wetland restorations, a lot of really fun stuff. And it's very enjoyable today to be driving through there and see some of the things that I actually did some 35 years ago. I moved into Owatonna for 1 year. Towards the end of that, it was the same job, just a different location. And again, had some really good experiences down there. In 1988, the waterfowl community across the U.S. Came together because after several years of very severe drought, especially in the Great Plains, the waterfowl population across North America had plummeted. We were having years of a 30-day duck season with a 3-bird limit. Today, for instance, it's 60 days and 6 birds. So some of the lowest populations recorded. And as a result of that, states and federal governments came together and they created what they called the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. It was a continent-wide plan to recover waterfowl populations and to be implemented state by state across the U.S. Shortly after that, Congress passed a bill called the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, which is still around today, still provides somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 to $60 million a year as grants to entities to do habitat improvement. In order to capitalize on that, the DNR created a new position called the Wetland Wildlife Program Leader position, which I was the first person to take that in 1990. It was responsible for guiding those North American Waterfowl Plan activities, for securing some of those Wetland Conservation Act dollars. The state of Minnesota passed the Wetland Conservation Act, a wetland protection bill in 1991. That position and a couple others in DNR were responsible for writing the implementation rules for that. I served on the Mississippi Flyway Technical Committee. It's a collection of 22 state and state agencies and private entities that annually discuss the status of waterfowl and set waterfowl population guidelines across the Mississippi Flyway. So it was a very, very enjoyable work from the standpoint of my interests, and had a lot of range of impact on policy, on actual securing of dollars and doing programs, and really allowed me to create and expand my network of connections. Of course, Ducks Unlimited was one of the big partners at the time. Ducks Unlimited, up until I believe it was 1984, spent all their money in Canada. 1984, they realized they had to do something in the U.S., so they created some positions in the U.S. to do habitat work. And I worked with a fellow by the name of Roger Peterson to help them get dollars and do some of their programs. Well, it turns out DU created their own state position in 1999, and they recruited me for that position. So I took that in 1999. I left the DNR, became the DU State Conservation Director. I'll tell you, this is one of those things that you may face in your career, going from what people consider to be a very safe job with a state agency, jumping onto a nonprofit where there's absolutely no security at all, was a bit of a leap of faith at the time, and a little bit risky for somebody early in their career. But again, being in the middle of the baby boom really presented, a lot of obstacles to promotion, because there were so many people who were a year or 5 years or 6 years older than me in positions that were right ahead of me. So there was not much likelihood I was going to be able to promote in those positions. So that helped me, two things that drove my willingness to jump into that position. One is that it was really work that I was interested in and excited about. And B, I saw that there just was a limited opportunity for me to get into another nice job at DNR. I'd been at DNR for, in that wetland wildlife position for almost 10 years. So it was time for me to move. So I took the DU State Conservation Director job that covered Iowa and Minnesota, oversaw all of DU's programs in the two states. And at the time, it was a period of big growth for Ducks Unlimited. We ended up having, it was all on the ground habitat management work. We ended up having 3 different kinds of programs. One was an engineering kind of a program where we would go to shallow prairie lakes that had been degraded by carp or by fathead minnows or some other problem. We would call in our engineers. They would devise an outlet structure that would allow us to draw water levels down. We could do a water drawdown and restore the vegetation, kill off the invasive carp, then put the water back, and it would come back as very nice, pristine prairie wetlands. We launched a very unique and important program for Minnesota oriented towards wild rice lakes. Minnesota, as you probably know, is one of the few states in the US that actually has extensive stands of native wild rice. Many of those lakes suffer from high water levels because of beavers. Beavers will dam up the outlet, they raise the water level. Wild rice doesn't do well in high water. And so we launched a program to pay trappers to trap beavers out of those outlets on 100 lakes across northern Minnesota. And so just an amazing response by those lakes. The wild rice came back tremendously and provided, not just food for ducks, but also wild rice for indigenous people, as well as anybody else who wants to go pick wild rice. Program is still going on today. It's tremendously successful, and very pleased with where that went. And the third avenue was that the federal government had really dug into the Wetlands Reserve Program, which was a program to pay landowners to take land on a production, put a permanent conservation easement on it, and restore the wetlands and grasslands under a perpetual easement. NRCS, the federal agency that implemented that, ultimately exceeded 50,000 acres, and DU took a big role in assisting with that by hiring technicians to go out and do some of that work. So very, very pleased with what we were able to do there. Ultimately, I decided DU was not the place I wanted to be. A previous deputy commissioner by the name of Ron Nardang was the state director at Nature Conservancy. He knew me because we had worked together on the Wetland Act years before, came calling and said he needed assistant state director for Nature Conservancy, which is the biggest nonprofit conservation organization on the globe. I took that job. Nature Conservancy was very focused on preserving prairies at the time, and also was looking at the problems with forest fragmentation and how to retain large forest blocks in Minnesota. So we did some really nice prairie work, mostly preserving, acquiring prairies, but also doing management with bison and with fire, and then pivoted a little bit towards forests. There is a tool out there that's still available today through the federal government called Forest Legacy that pays landowners to put an easement on their property to that requires them to not subdivide it, not build on it, could manage it sustainably, and in some cases allow public hunting. Because the economy was booming, people were moving into northern Minnesota, breaking up these large forests and just fragmenting the forest. Nature Conservancy led the effort to start acquiring massive conservation easements. So we bought easements from large landowners like Potlatch, and Forest Capital Partners was another large holder, and Blandon Foundation. And during that time, we and partners acquired some 330,000 acres of easements across Minnesota. So those forests now in northern Minnesota are totally protected. In 2011, Governor Dayton was elected. I had been concerned for a long time about the direction the DNR was going. I've always had an affection for the department because of the people and the work they do, but it was disturbing to me to see some of the political hacks who had been serving in the past few administrations, and I thought they were driving DNR into the ground, as well as then subsequently reducing the beneficial work that DNR was doing. So I threw my hat in the ring. I interviewed for the job just like you would any other job. I did not own a suit for my first interview. I had to go out and buy one. I kept the tags on it just in case I didn't get the job. I got a second interview, so I took the tags off, and then I subsequently got the job. And so I served as a DNR commissioner from 2011 to 2019. The reality of that job is you don't do any actual work. You make a lot of decisions, you tell people what to do, but you don't do any actual work. So I can't point to a piece of land on the ground and say, I did this, but we did a lot of really nice stuff. And the thing I'm most proud of is that we really put a focus on prairies, our most threatened ecosystem. So the divisions that do land acquisition, especially ecological and water resources, and fish and wildlife, put a premium on doing prairie conservation, and I think made a significant improvement in that. When Governor Walz was elected, he wanted to go a different direction. I was out of a job for 6 weeks until I got my current job, which is Save the Boundary Waters. I work now as a completely different arena. This is advocacy work. The Boundary Waters is threatened by a proposed sulfide ore copper nickel mine on the edge of the Boundary Waters, but in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. If that mine goes in, it will irreparably damage the water and even the landscape of the Boundary Waters. And so this organization has been fighting that mine since 2014. We do a lot of federal legislative work. We work with Congress. Representative Betty McCollum is carrying a bill to protect the Boundary Waters. We've got 3 or 4 lawsuits going because the Trump administration has just rolled over legal process and precedent. And we've got some state activities going, as well as this huge public outreach program to let people know what's going on so that we can ultimately get the decision makers to see that this is the wrong way to go. So that is the trajectory of the work that I did. As I mentioned, real joy in this work is not that you're going to make a boatload of money. I can tell you, most wildlife managers retire with a very modest pension, but what they've got is they've got a very proud portfolio of work that was accomplished. I will say right at the start, almost anything that gets done that is worth noting is a result of a lot of people working on it. And anything that I can point to is only a function of my being a part of the team that did it. And I mentioned some of these, these are some of the things though that I can look back at and I can say, wow, I'm pretty pleased with what we've been able to accomplish. So the Wetland Conservation Act rules that we adopted back in 1982, they're still in place. The Wetlands Conservation Act has protected our prairie potholes, has protected all of our wetlands, which is extremely important at a time like this when the federal government's walking away from wetlands protection. Believe it or not, once upon a time, wild turkeys were almost non-existent in Minnesota, except for the southeast. I helped do the reintroduction of turkeys down in Carver County and Scott County. If you have turkeys that are roosting on your house and crapping on it or flying into your car, don't blame me. I only put 40 of them out there, the rest of them were on their own. I mentioned some of those shallow lakes that we recovered. Was participating in at least 15 of those, including Heron Lake and Lake Christina, where we did big engineering projects on the outlet and helped set up the management for those lakes. There's still more than 60 wild rice lakes that are restored. I actually pick wild rice, and so it's been a real pleasure to go to some of these lakes in the fall and see the abundant rice on them and see all the critters that are using those. I mentioned we had some 15,000 acres of wetland reserve program. Most of you know that a square mile is 640 acres, so that's in the order of 25 square miles of perpetual wetlands and grasslands that have been restored. At the Nature Conservancy, we purchased a 24,000 acre cattle ranch up near Moorhead, or up near Crookston, I should say. Through the WRP program, we restored all of the prairie and wetlands on that property, some 8,000 acres of wetlands. Subsequently worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service, conveyed it to the Fish and Wildlife Service, who added some additional acres to it. It's now the most recent, the 13th and most recent National Wildlife Refuge in Minnesota, called Glacial Ridge, and it's just a gem in the state, and very proud of the work on that. Many acres of wildlife management area I worked on. I mentioned the forest easements, 330,000 acres of forest easements. And one of the most important things, again, a very minor part in this, but my role was to kind of coordinate the green groups and the hunting groups, was that in prior to 2008, there'd been a 10-year effort to try and get long-term funding for conservation that didn't depend on hunting and fishing licenses. You know it today as a legacy amendment. It passed in 2008 by virtue of some really good work by a lot of groups. I had a little role in that. Today that addition to our sales tax is adding $100 million a year to conservation, which is virtually double the dollars that DNR has otherwise to do habitat work on the ground. So very happy with what happened there as well. And then finally I mentioned the renewed emphasis on prairie protection at DNR, and I'm pleased to see that they are still carrying forward some of that work. So again, nobody gets into this business for the money. You have to have a personal value that appreciates nature, appreciates accomplishments on the ground, and has some endurance beyond our lifetime. That picture in the background is a waterfowl production area. Some of the money that we got from the Wetland Conservation Act went into waterfowl production area acquisition. So again, very satisfying to be out walking on ground, hunting on ground. It's now in public ownership that I helped acquire one of my previous positions. And so just a quick list of some of the big lessons I've learned in this time. You know, continuing education is just extremely important. Things are changing all the time. You know, I realized mid-career that if I did want to be an administrator, that I really needed to know something more about budgets, about accounting, about human resources. I went and got a MBA, Master of Business Administration from the university, and it served me, I believe, extremely well in later administrative positions, because that's not the kind of thing you get in your traditional natural resources program. And it's learning, you should be learning something new every year, even if it's how to get up share a presentation on a Zoom call. That's important learning as well. Wildlife management is not really wildlife management. You don't really go out and do much directly with wildlife. You work with habitat, but as often as not, you're working with people. And that was a really hard lesson to learn, because you know, my original vision of being in a fire tower was just reflective, I think, of the trait many of us have, and that is we're introverts. And introverts want to be out in the woods by themselves. They don't want to be around a lot of people. Well, that's not really what wildlife managers do. They spend a lot of time working with people. And so you really have to learn some of those soft skills about working with people, collaborating with people, giving credit where it's due, and being able to work through conflict. Networking is extraordinarily important. You know, it's how you get things done. You work on teams with people. You learn of opportunities, not just for yourself, but for funding and so on by networking. Really important that you emphasize some of that. Communication skills. You know, not a week goes by where I'm not talking to some group somewhere, and that's been true for 30 years. And so you oftentimes have to take very, very complicated biology and put it into, you know, the level where a fourth grader can understand it, and then be effective in your communication. Again, something I had a little bit of exposure to in college, but not a lot. And it's one of those things that people can be working on their whole life, especially if you aspire to have a higher level public position. You just really fundamentally have to be a good communicator. Goals, you know, at least initially my goal was just to get out of school and get a job. But if you don't have an idea of where you want to be in 1 year, in 3 years, and 5 years, then you're really not going to be moving in the direction that's going to get you there. When we do performance reviews with staff, I always ask them, you know, where do you want to be in 1 year? Where do you want to be in 3 years? Where do you want to be in 5 years? In part so that I can help them figure out what they need to do to develop into that position. If somebody wants to stay in their current job forever, that's great. I don't begrudge them for that. But if you think you want to promote into something else and move into something else, you should be taking steps today to make you the right person for that. Flexibility, you know, as I mentioned, I always thought I wanted to be the waterfowl biologist. Realized that there were other options that would allow me to engage in waterfowl management that didn't require me to be the waterfowl specialist. And so being flexible in what you do, and again, recognizing that no position is the final position, that sometimes you have to take something that's a little less than your goal, because that's a stepping stone to where you want to get. And I think it's really important as well to be really thinking, you know, do some self-reflection. You know, what do I want to do? You know, what is my passion? What's going to make me want to jump out of bed in the morning and go to work? And also recognizing that changes over time. You know, what I want to do today is different than what I wanted to do 20 years ago. And being able to constantly evaluate that, you know, objectively, and then figure out how to put that into action, I think is really important. And one of the most important things I'll offer is, you know, there are just a relative handful of natural resources jobs out there that are literally trying to hold back the tide of degradation of our environment. You know, there are 4,000 people that work at DNR. They're covering the whole state. There's, you know, 200 conservation officers covering the whole state. And so every one of them has got an insurmountable job. It's just a huge undertaking for them to do what they have to do. So we don't have any room for sloughers, is my point here. Every job is really important, and we need everybody who gets one of these jobs to take it really seriously and do the best job they can, because we are, you know, essentially fighting a losing battle. We've got a growing population, we've got diminishing habitat, we've got climate change and any number of other things that are degrading our habitat. We need everybody out there going full speed and not just occupying a space. But at the same time, what I'll tell you, and I always tell my employees this, is you still have to have balance in your life. You could spend your whole day, every day, working to save the environment and still not get it done. You have to recognize and put some good boundaries around how you spend your time, so that you have a healthy lifestyle outside of the job, you have a family, and you pursue your education and your financial structure as well. So take each job seriously, do your best, but maintain balance in your life. So with that, Mike, that's really all I've got on the slides. So I would be happy at this point to take any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. I'm going to read off the questions that rolled in the messages while you're speaking. So Caroline says, thank you so much for presenting your journey today. I'm also very passionate about wetlands conservation, and it's fulfilling to hear about another person's successes and contributions in that area. Are there any other projects that you're considering getting involved in?
Oh my God. Really what I want to do is I want to just travel around the US now, but so I'm, in addition to being on with the Save the Boundary Waters campaign, I'm a board member for Delta Waterfall nonprofit. And so I'm helping them, especially, it really started with them. So I'm trying to help them figure out how to move forward. One of the things that I've been really involved in the last 9 years, which I want to continue to emphasize, is that the traditional community of hunting and fishing has been a old white guy community. And if we are going to be relevant in the future, we need to we need to be aggressive in recruiting people of color, women, people of other diversity, get them into a love of the outdoors as well, because people only protect those things that they care about. And we need to recognize the population is changing. We need to get more and more people outdoors. When I was commissioner, I did one very short stint where I worked with a urban group to get urban kids out ice fishing. And it was amazing to me that these kids lived, blocks away from lakes, and they had never even walked on the ice because it was just not in their culture to do that. And we went out, took them fishing, and they just loved it. And so the point is that don't assume that people don't want to do something simply because they aren't doing it. It's because they've not had the opportunity to be introduced. They don't have the confidence because they haven't learned the skills, but those are all things that can be taught. So I think I want to continue to be engaged in getting kids outdoors, getting diverse communities outdoors as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to talk about sort of your paradigms related to your sort of primary conservation focuses shifting maybe from habitat to policies and that sort of thing, and now to thinking about kids and involving others in outdoors. So that's cool. The next question comes from Angelique Dahlberg. Angelique says, thank you for sharing your experiences, Tom. Throughout your life and career, how have you balanced and reconciled the competing goals and values of conservation versus preservation?
Good question. I don't think that there is a bright line between conservation and preservation. If I had to sort of self-define what preservation is, it means you hold something in place, like put a glass dome over it and hold it in place so that it doesn't change over time. While there's some value to that as a concept, I think in practice it is almost impossible. The state has a program called the Scientific and Natural Area Program, and the intention of it was that we should think of this program as the Noah's Ark for the biota of Minnesota. So we need to save all these unique little chunks of habitat across the state so that we preserve our natural history. Well, the fact is, climate is changing. The fact is we've got invasive species, and so these communities are changing, and we are doing rear defense, trying to keep them the way they are. And I know there's a lot of chatter in the conservation biology world about whether or not, trying to hold on to these communities versus letting them become quote unquote novel communities is the right thing to do. I think as long as I've got to think about it, I just soon preserve them as they are, because we need that biological diversity, especially in the face of uncertainty of climate change. Whereas conservation, I view, the underpinnings of the definition of conservation is wise use. In other words, we have this land, we're getting some utility out of it, whether it's grazing or whether it's forestry or whatever it is. I think society at large is much more comfortable with conservation than they are with preservation, because preservation has this moniker of hands-off, whereas conservation has this sense of, well, there's some value back to society, even if it's not necessarily large sums of money, but it's still providing some utility to communities. So I think when people feel like they do not have contributed to something but they don't get to use, they're gonna push back, and we've seen that with the Scientific and Natural Areas program. Whereas when people see some personal value to something, they generally support it. So I think conservation is always going to be the biggest element, I think, to conserving our biological heritage.
I see Julia is on video. Julia, do you want to ask your question, or should I relay it to Tom?
Sure, I'm happy to ask it. I'll just read out what I wrote, and then I can clarify if need be. But yeah, thank you for sharing your experience and your wisdom with us. And I especially appreciated your points about the developing goals and also self-reflection. Yeah, just always thinking about how to do that better. And I also, you mentioned the importance of communication as well. And I'm just wondering if you have any tips for developing communication skills in graduate school and also beyond, how to sort of continually build that into a good practice, I guess.
Sure. In my undergrad program, we had a technical writing and a public speaking classes, and that was really the extent of what we had. Everybody hates public speaking. I still hate public speaking. I mean, I don't like it at all. But I always told myself when I was commissioner, well, the governor doesn't pay me to be an introvert. The governor's paying me to be an extrovert, so I better go out and do it. And so, I did take some additional training, kind of workshops on public speaking. A lot of it is videotaping yourself and, seeing what you like, what you don't like. But there's professional training you can get even at the U, on public speaking, as well as just writing for lay people. I think getting that education, an educational foundation, is a good start. But then it's really practicing. And so I've often heard this from people who are good public speakers, that there's an organization called Toastmasters International, and it is, a bunch of professional people in a city or in a county, and they get together monthly. And that's what they do. They go and they give presentations to each other, and then they get feedback. And again, it's really painful. It's like, geez, I know I say too much, but now to have somebody tell me I say too much really hurts. But that's, candidly, that's how you improve. And so, you see these politicians giving these good presentations, not because they were born orators. It's because they learned how to do it and got feedback on it. And I just think, it's really, really important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think we have one more question that came in, and we'll call this our last question to be respectful of timelines. Nina Hill asks, what can this audience do to support the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness?
Oh, outstanding. That's a wonderful question. I like that one. Well, if you go to our website, which is savetheboundarywaters.org, there's a lot of information on there, and it's all about the threat. It's all about some of the science behind the threat. But there's also a place where you can sign the petition. And if you sign the petition, that's kind of an effort that will put you on a long list, but also it will allow you to get into our email database. So then we can send you updates and give you additional information. Right now, as I mentioned, we're working on multiple fronts. The Congress, through Betty McCollum, has a bill in, it's HR 5598, that would prohibit mining in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. We're now encouraging our senators, both Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar, to sponsor a Senate companion. What ultimately compels them to do it is if they hear from a lot of folks. And so that's the nature, that's the purpose of our database, is that we will send alerts out to people that now is the time to contact Tina Smith. We've got 3 or 4 lawsuits going on. That's support is appreciated in that, but it's not as interactive as congressional stuff. But we're also going to be very active at the Capitol this year, Minnesota State Capitol. We're going to try and pass a state companion to the federal bill on protecting the Boundary Waters. So I'd say the best thing is just engage, just plug in, just look at the website, get the emails. We've got a Twitter and an Instagram account as well. And then when the request comes to call your senator, just do it and vote.
Thank you very much, Tom. All important messages. And I want to first thank you for joining us today and talking to us today about your career path, and it was very informative. I want to thank you for your conservation work in Minnesota over the last 40 years. It's awesome. And as a Minnesotan who gets to enjoy that, I sincerely appreciate your work. And then I'll conclude by congratulating you on your many career accomplishments and also on your prestigious FWCB Alumni of the Year award.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you. And I'm just delighted to know you're all going to change the world for the better over the next, your next 40 years.
Thanks a lot, Tom.